Yeah, capital with a K.
Oh, yeah. See.
As far as these slides are concerned.
Yeah,
Put a wide shot in here. That's exactly
what's going to get us left.
I'm gonna put it right here.
You're very nice.
a big question.
I just unmuted you.
To be or not to be the mic.
That's right. Yes. Without the mic, we're all in trouble.
That's true.
Can you up just fine?
We're sitting on the front row so we can hear you no matter what.
Okay.
Cool.
That's why we said
Y'all too. So anybody online is gonna hear any chatter in the room.
Oh, no. Be careful what we say then.
No snide remarks.
Okay, now
Stay with that.
it's about time to go.
It is about time.
I'm supposed to introduce you. Are you ready? You want to wait a minute or two?
Y'all are being live streamed if anybody's watching, so.
So I should start.
You can wait, it's up to y'all.
No, you're fine. Yes. Whatever you do.
Welcome, I'm Kathy McCallie. I'm introducing Dr. Joe Bessler, and it is an honor and a delight for me to introduce my friend and colleague. There are scholars who stay safely within their disciplines, and then there are those who remind us that we need maps to navigate intersections. Dr. Joe Bessler has been a part of Phillips. He is the oldest serving employee.
Such superlative.
Joe's the Robert Travis Peake Professor of Theology here at Phillips Theological Seminary. He has built his career here serving in those generative and sometimes uncomfortable spaces where theology meets politics, where poetry encounters rhetoric, where the sacred and the cultural collide and create something new. Joe studied at Northwestern University. He began his educational journey there in communication studies, where he developed a fascination with rhetoric under the guidance of Thomas Farrell. That early training in how language shapes reality has informed everything he's done since then. He's the author of several books, including Law and Theology, Cases and Readings, A Scandalous Jesus, How Three Historic Quests Changed Theology for the Better, and most recently, Being Moved by Moving Words, crediting rhetoric in the Theopoetics of John D. Caputo. The last title gives you a sense of where Joe's mind lives, in the space where words do more than describe. They create, they move, they transform. So let's welcome Dr. Joe Bessler to tell us more about his research and his latest publication.
Let's see. Thanks, Kathy. Let's see, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, we'll take that as a yes.
No, I can't really hear you back
Right, right. It's partly my voice, just, yes. Oh. It's delightful to be here, to see these faces. Many of you have been a part of my life here, and it is a joy to see you. And so we can guess now. Who put this up? Who put this up? I actually think it's a certain church historian who was talking about Caputo. That's just my hand. That's just my hand. Let's see here. How does this? supposed to say that if you are online and can't see the slides, you should click being moved by moving words under the video to follow along. You've got a race to keep up with those moving words. You've got to. Okay, now let's see if I can get this to do. There it is, being moved by moving words. Crediting rhetoric in the Theopoetics of John D. Caputo. It's hard to know in a relatively short amount of time what to focus on, because in some ways, this is a book about a book. Or better, it's a book about engaging another author. And so I'll be talking about that as I go. But I thought it was more important that I begin, in case you actually wanted to read the book, I give you a little bit of an introduction about how I'm thinking about rhetoric and the rhetorical character of theology, right? So that you can then say, okay, not so bad, we can get through this. I mean, the nice thing about this thin little book is that if you don't like a chapter, heck, it's not going to last that much longer. Yes.
He's gonna test the microphone.
You can test the microphone.
You can keep going, but
Sure.
just to know it will
It
be
is, oh,
allowed.
let's see. Now, to make sure, I should also, well, when we get to some questions, I'll put a mic out in the audience there, just because I've got hearing loss at this point in a way in my life which I haven't before. And I'm fumbling in my pants for a microphone extender. Okay, so being moved by moving words. Let's think about this for just a few minutes. What moves us? I believe it was Sarah last night who spoke of being moved by this event. Her participation in it, the invitation to her to participate, to be part of it. But when we speak of being moved, what are the locations of that? You can chip in here if you'd like, in terms of, I've often thought of nature as being moved by something that occurs there. We can be moved by the compassion of another. We can be moved by beauty,
Music.
a sense of awe, the sublime. So I'm playing off of that. We'll talk a little bit more about why in a minute. But then we've also got this being moved by moving words. This is actually getting at the argument of my book. That we are moved by words that are not simply literal, they're moving. They're not static, they're dynamic.
Right.
And what does it mean to be open to that sense of word, of language that isn't simply frozen, but is, again, quite literally, moving. The language of narrative, the language of symbol, the language of metaphor, of analogy. Theologians have been interested in this and this set of topics ever since certainly I've been going to graduate school, although some have been resisting this right along. So I want to talk about this. And then as a little subtitle, crediting rhetoric. I love the word crediting in this. I got it from Seamus Heaney, whom we'll hear from in just a minute. But Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, his address, his Nobel address, is called Crediting Poetry, right? And I love the resonance within that word. So to credit rhetoric in the Theopoetics of John D. Caputo. Am I arguing against John D. Caputo? No. Never do that. No. So in one sense, absolutely not. I love John Caputo's work. Right. That's what kind of, you'll hear more about this in a minute. But it's more a sense of, I'm also using his work to turn towards rhetoric, because I don't see him giving the credit to rhetoric that is so actually rich in his work, right? So in terms of questions and answers, I can recommend a couple of texts from him, and reading the two alongside each other might be helpful as well. You might find that helpful. Okay, so here we go. Oh, keep going. Let's begin with a poem by Seamus. And this is called Postscript. It's the last poem in a collection called The Spirit Level. And the spirit level, of course, is a tool, right? It's used to measure whether things are in balance or, right? So it's a wonderful play on words. Heaney loves to write about tools, about farm equipment, about all sorts of things. So here we go, and try to keep this in mind. I don't think I'm going to be flipping back to this screen. Well, maybe I could, but here we go. And sometime, make the time to drive out west into County Clare, along the flaggy shore, in September or October, where the wind and the light are working off each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter. And inland, among stones, the surface of a slate gray lake is lit by the earth and lightning of a flock of swans. Their feathers ruffed and ruffling white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think that you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there. You are neither here nor there. A hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big, soft buffetings come at the car sideways, catch the heart off guard, and blow it open. Now let's think about that poem, because at one level, here we have someone, see if I can go back. I'm never very good at that. Yeah. Because notice how it starts here. It starts out by saying and you're like, where's the first half of this here? You're starting off with and? So it gives it a conversational tone. Right. And then you have a sense almost of a conversation, or that and sometime make the time to drive out west to County Clare along the flaggy shore. Right. He's giving you some directions. Here's what you ought to see. And one of the reasons what you're going to see is you're going to maybe turn around a corner, right, as you're driving along the flaggy shore. And there will be the ocean on one side, wild with foam and glitter, and a virtual image of the sublime. And then at the same time, over here, there's inland, right? Inland, the surface of a slate gray lake is lit by the earth. This is the beautiful. You've got somebody driving along and encountering two great aesthetic experiences, right? In terms of aesthetic theories, the sublime and the beautiful. And here then there's this kind of advice that's being given. Useless to think you'll stop and capture it more thoroughly. At one level, this poem reads descriptively like an event, like something that's occurred.
Yeah.
But let's think of it a little bit differently. Because the poet here seems to be speaking to the reader. And in this, what begins to happen is, as you're reading, suddenly it doesn't really matter if you're in County Clare or along the Flaggy Shore, because the poem and its words are taking you there. Right? And so if we begin to feel towards the weight of those lines, that you are neither here nor there, we're no longer talking description, we're talking existential language. This is where your heart becomes blown open. At this point, what we're seeing is words creating a reality, not simply imitating one. So at one level, this poem is describing, there's a little trip for you to take. No big deal, nothing at all. Might even have a marvelous experience. But notice, I don't know about you, but if I'm actually going along the Flaggy Shore, and I've had the privilege of doing this one time. Talk about that, question and answer. But I would sit there and say, wow, that's cool. That's right. But here he is kind of giving you a sense of what's happening to you in a much deeper way. Poetry creates a kind of reality. No questions just yet. Just yes, hi.
It's like the difference between driving, seeing that, and getting your iPhone out to take a picture versus actually being there.
Yes, well,
It's a
yes,
double
but
meaning
then
of being.
here also, that's Walker Percy is famous for an essay in which he talks about that. You know, people with their cameras and they're getting an image, why don't you just be present to the event? But here I'm asking you to notice something else. I'm asking you to notice the way the language of the poem itself takes you and moves you to a different space.
Yes.
So that even if you go there to County Clare, this in spirit, that's in a sense where you've gone once you've had this kind of, oh. So this book is really the story of an emerging friendship with Jack Caputo, who I got to know through the West Star a seminar on God. So there's the Jesus seminar, they've done seminars on Paul, this is a seminar on God, and we got to know one another. Not simply between two scholars, but between two models of public discourse. One might say hermeneutics, interpretation, one might say rhetoric. He likes, along with hermeneutics, the language of Theopoetics. Why poetics? Because it's not literal, objective, but it's figurative, it's metaphorical, it's not literal, right? It's making connections, it's not nailing something down. So each of these, both hermeneutics in its way and rhetoric, invite and challenge us to become more at home with the language of uncertainty. Uncertainty in our philosophical, in our religious, in our cultural claims to authenticity. We're the ones who've got the truth. Those Catholics open, no. Jewish people, yeah, they're nice, but no, we've got the truth here. And the cultural claims of authority to truth and to power. Caputo sees a problem, a key problem, in religious language. Even as we mean the best in our use of religious language, we built into that language at this point over centuries is a whole set of power claims. Power claims of omnipotence, of lordship, of kingship, that bring with them a whole cluster. The way language works brings with it a whole cluster of other verbs, adjectives, adverbs, empowering power, and allowing us to not consider what's really going on. Because after all, our all-powerful God is also all-loving. So this is in some ways what this book is about. There's not a lot of narrative of Jack and I going out for beer or something like that. But, you know, he's what, in his mid-80s, I think, and just has been utterly gracious to me as I've been writing this book, because, as I say in a minute here, on the one hand, I'm tracking with Jack, and on the other hand, I'm not, because I want to emphasize the work of rhetoric, not just interpretation. Right? These overlap. You could say, this is a book about nothing. Well, close. But isn't that a fascinating topic? So what I'm trying to do is to suggest that a rhetorical reading of Jack's work. So I'm using this as an experiment. I'm taking this marvelous, famous philosophical theologian's work, and I'm saying, he seems to be avoiding rhetorical language. He doesn't seem to like the language in any sense of proof. He doesn't like the language of argument. He doesn't really like the language of debate. He kind of likes persuasion, but as I say, he's trying to smuggle persuasion in from the rhetorical camp. He's a tricky devil. And so I think that here's my experiment, that it can open up a space that's more suited for getting at the genuine forcefulness of Jack's work. So I really do encourage you to kind of get into it, go with the flow, go with it, and then his own emphasis on what he calls theopoetics. I like it. I don't think it has the forcefulness it needs, the forcefulness it has. Okay, here we go. So, part one, and you say, where were we if this was part one? That was the introduction. And so there's a couple of things I want us to look at here. And I don't even think there's a major slide for the next move, but I want us first to get a sense of why this moving words to uncertainty. Let's explore this a little bit more. Then I want us to think theologically here, right? The first one is not even one I use in the book, but I think it's helpful. And that is thinking about the resources of doing theology. Right? The way we think about those, and the way we might rethink the way we think about those. And then topics, the topics of theology. And again, if you've been in class with me, you might say, I know what Joe's up to here. Well, sort of, I bet. That's why it's remind as well as renew.
But does it have a map?
Oh, does it have a map?
Okay. Well, one hears this all the time in the midst of Christian nationalism. The Bible says it. I believe that settles it. There's a kind of proof. What more do you need? Right? You've got this. Look, the Bible says it. That's an objective claim, isn't it? Right?
Which Bible?
And
Which
then
translation?
here's the subjective part. I believe it. And then that settles it.
No more.
What you believe, not so important. Difference of belief, what? Vis-a-vis the truth, how could there be? So there's this neat little formula that gives you this sense of certainty, of surety, right? And yet, what's the it? Oh,
Yeah, no
where's the
kidding.
extra slide? There it is. What's the it?
Yeah.
The Bible says what? So when you begin to identify a text, the way Karl Barth does in his famous study on Letter to the Romans. Why? What about the other Bible? What about the other texts in the Bible? Why are you focusing on this one? Interesting. The Bible? Do you mean the prophetic books? Do you mean the Psalms? Do you mean the yawn? Do you mean right? Do you mean the Gospels? The letters? And once you begin, right? Once you begin to, oh, this is Jack here in a second. Once you begin to open this up, one begins to see, oh, this is not nearly so. The fact that you believe something settles anything? What? Glad you have a belief.
Yeah.
But what do you do with others' beliefs? Do you respect them? That settles it. Does it dismiss them? Right. Notice the way in which that statement can be used to execute real power vis-a-vis those described as the other, the immigrant. Who'd have thought this? But this is the kind of thinking that drives that kind of thinking. So here's John. And this is from a little essay, a short précis. There's two big books I worked on here. One is The Weakness of God, the other is The Insistence of God. And what the heck, I'll just go ahead and say this. If you're just getting started reading Caputo, there's a thin little volume on what would Jesus deconstruct that I think is actually quite helpful. He gives you he's really one of the best writers out there, and he gives you a very good sense, I certainly needed it, on kind of using Derrida and in terms of seeing how this plays out in more theological discourse. So, and then there's a host of other texts as well. But in this essay, he writes, in good provocative style, you wouldn't think that somebody who's writing on the weakness of God would write this forcefully, but there you go. There is no big biggie. No big book, no big institutional body to back up what I am calling weak theology. Its force is weak, its voice reduced to the whisper of what it has to say. It lays down the sword of the absolutes, the inerrant books and the infallible decrees that confessional theology carries at its side. Favor of peace, of the weak force of what it has to say. The weak force of persuasion. Not the sword, but at this point, this is why I say, because there are passages, believe me, I found them, where he uses the word, right, persuasion in just this sense, right? Which at that point, I say to him, Jack, you're talking rhetoric at that point. Well, can't, right? So we're just getting started. We're just getting started. But here we go. This is, in fact, I may have skipped something I wanted to include. For Caputo, again, informed by folks like Jacques Derrida, Emmanuel Levinas, other kind of major countries, very kind of complex voices and profound voices in the mid to late 20th century. For Caputo, we live embedded in language. We never get outside of it. Words don't point to things. That's not how language operates. Words play by a set of differences. The word tree is different from thee and free and be, and we learn to parse these things. Right? It's not that there's a pointing dynamic that says, oh yeah, boy, that's the tree I'm talking about. Because you can be standing right next to someone and say, now, which one is it? Is it the one with the, I mean, there's just ambiguity soaking through language. You don't get to an objective point. You are always already misinterpreting. You're always, and that's not a bad thing. If we have some capacity to embrace it, some capacity to embrace difference. So if we're embedded in language, there's no getting to things themselves. Words don't have the power of certainty. They may have the power to persuade if they're listening. And that's why Caputo says it's hermeneutics all the way down. It's interpretation all the way down. And what I like about his work, frankly, is that among the theologians I read, he is the one who most faithfully sees that all the way down. He's not trying to bail out Revelation at the last minute. Right? He's not trying to say, oh, and, no, he's trying to say, if we're genuinely uncertain all the way down, what does that mean we can say? Right? What does it mean how we should say? Even more, how we should respond. It's this play of call and response in his work. So hence so I thought somewhere in here, I had a bunch of notes. I'm just kind of fun from the preface of the the text. Let's see here. If you'll bear with me here. He himself, he says himself, that he could rightfully pass for an atheist. So you can understand why I need to begin by confessing my weakness for the theology of John Caputo. The truth is, I have been moved by his work. That's the title. The truth is, I've been moved by his work. More forcefully than I, as a seminary professor, should have been. I suspect I could easily have avoided this temptation. This late have I read thee affection. Seeing that I am now somewhat late in my professional career, but I feel compelled to confess that I experienced in my reading of his work something completely unexpected. What can only be called the event of a call. And that is to say, of hearing a call in my reading of his writing. Something, I'm not sure what, surprised and spoke to something in me as if I had been longing and waiting and in a sense haunted from a long way away by this call. To be clear, when I first picked up his work, I did not know Jack well at all. He was outside my conventional circuit, my orbit, and I could not have anticipated the way his work would move me. In The Weakness of God, as well as in other texts, Caputo crafts a deeply moving proposal that rhymes with and deepens my interests and commitments, while he reimagines Theologos' Theopoetics, embracing both the uncertainty and the creativity of all things. I find the forcefulness of his work to be entwined or tangled with my interest in the work of rhetoric, which is, as theorist Tom Farrell writes, is the fine and useful art of making things matter. Great moment, isn't it, right? So in these pages, I will seek at once to walk in Caputo's path, but not. Finding in his work a call that moves me in a very similar yet different directions, I seek through my attention to his theological proposals to offer something of a counterpath to his emphasis on hermeneutics or interpretation, insisting instead that rhetoric, out of its own deep listening, calls to hermeneutics and presses it to action in public. Rhetoric, I will suggest, is the public prophetic push to Caputo's hermeneutics, the call insisting to be spoken out loud. Just a bit more. To use his words, I want to suture or wire up his language of interpretation of hermeneutics all the way down with my understanding of rhetoric that calls us not simply into, but also in a sense out of hermeneutics and into the forcefulness of decision and public action. It is not an either or choice between the two that I am proposing. Rather, I am calling attention to the importance of rhetoric on behalf of the poetic imagination that Caputo uses to open up the transformative work of the discipline that used to be called theology. Put it another way, when one asks what's going on in the works of Jack Caputo, one good, helpful answer is by showing how he puts his theopoetics together. How does this work? So to really acknowledge uncertainty and moving it into involves letting go of those absolute claims of Christian superiority, of possessing truths that justify the colonial expansion of Christian empire, social movements like Christian nationalism, right? And for many of us, we first need some help in recognizing those problems are there in Christian discourse. That in itself, I remember any number of you in seminary, in intro to theology, beginning to look at some of these issues. I remember one student responding to the essay by James Cone, God is Black, and just about having a fit. And I don't blame him. What did we grow up with saying? This seems heretical. But it's also a provocation to think. It's a provocation to say, why am I having this emotional reaction? What might I be missing? Is there a claim here I need to hear? So one of the most important things I think we do at Phillips, and certainly at other schools as well, but we try to nurture a kind of questioning process in our reading. Don't silence the question. Whether it's on behalf of doctrine or it's critical of doctrine, don't silence that, but bring it forward. And try to bring it to a space where you can listen to it. Because listening is key. We often think of rhetoric as there's empty rhetoric, there's nothing but rhetoric, there's so much rhetoric. It's a dismissive term. And that's something we can look at in the history of rhetoric and how did we get there? But genuine rhetoric, and as Tom Farrell begins to unwind it, begins with an openness. You've got to be open. Rhetoric doesn't come from nowhere. It's always already drawing on the social knowledge of the audience it's speaking to. It's always already both acknowledging an audience, but also trying to make an audience. Right? Try to bring people into the fold. Right? So you've got to be listening to difference to do rhetoric well. We might like to think our interpretations are sure and absolute. Maybe even omnipotent. Certainly, special. So what kind of discipline is theology if it's not? How are we doing here? We got till 4:15, right? I better speed this up a little bit, but so we have a good bit of time. So what kind of discipline is theology? It's like, holy cow, I always thought you could teach theology well here. If it's not an explanation of the truth, by which we judge others.
Yes.
If we have right belief, we tend to congratulate ourselves. And those others, they're not measuring up. They don't look like us either. So I suggest we think of theology as a rhetorical discourse. The next two parts of the talk are going to look at two important moves here in what theology deals with, right? Which is, as Aristotle pointed out, is for situations that are neither logically nor factually demonstrable. Right? Rather, they are situations calling for engagement and persuasion. In other words, you can't prove this. And yet, notice how much of our public life, how many of the decisions we are called to make. And really, quite literally, there are situations that call to us. One might say we have a president who's virtually calling us to rethink citizenship, to begin to say, I feel called to speak out against this person. Some might be called to defend him. What do we do when we get together? So there's this sense of when things are not factually certain, we long to make them so. We long by insistence, we long by power to force others, to compel others to believe or get the hell out. It's when we rely on that, we're no longer arguing with a sense of respect for the other. We're right, you're wrong. We're first class, you are somewhere behind. So these are situations that call for persuasion. That in itself, remember, it's not just talk, it's this process of listening. Okay. So the study of rhetoric involves the study of public discourse. It's usually not dealing with private discourse. Right? That cannot be settled by proof. Okay. Instead, rhetoric is both the study of persuasion, but also the practice of it. The study and the practice of invencio, it's the Latin from Cicero. Jack likes the language of poein when he's talking about poesis, which comes from the Greek meaning to make. Well, son of a gun, Jack, here is at the heart of rhetoric is that this is the process of invencio, of making new arguments, of making persuasive arguments. And Jack would say, does this, in poetics, does this mean it's always going to work out well? No, there are no proofs like that. There are no certainties like that. That's not the world we live in. Right? So here we go. All right. So public arguments, the resource. No, so Aristotle, God love him, really focuses on these three.
Right.
Logos, he says, this is where you get arguments from. You attend to reason, right? Models of reason. That model might come from Platonic reason. It might come from Aristotelian. It might come from the Cynics, the skeptics. Oh, yeah, yeah. Along with, in some different schools of thought, you also see this emphasis on kairos. Paul Tillich loves that one. And as it's kairos having with it a sense of urgency, right? That's also if you can convince a crowd that an issue is urgent. Right? Liberation theologians are quite good on this. Right? There's an urgent problem that we need to attend to. Right? Feminist theology as well. Right? Womanist theology. Right? So I find it interesting that someone like John Bessler was familiar with Aristotle's Rhetoric and urged pastors to read it in order to develop their preaching skills. Wesley's an interesting character. He's both influenced by Locke and others of the kind of the early Enlightenment rationalism, who basically, they want to silence the rhetoric, right? They want the new science. They want objective study. They want discourse that is, if not demonstrably true, clearly probable, right? And so they want to get rid of what they see is this emphasis on rhetoric that has become, oh my goodness, it's the elite classes and it's puffed up discourse. So this is a very real moment in the history of rhetoric. And that is that, boy, it takes a dive from having been central to classic thought you get to the basis, to the beginnings of modernity, and you start hearing suspicions. We're tired, right, of these, oh, noble speeches, blah, blah, blah. So, but rather we need to listen to science. We need to, interesting how that's playing out. So, keep going here for a bit. Any good Methodists? So let's just, why might I even have scripture, tradition,
I don't know.
reason, and experience? See, this is fun. This is the remind part of reminding, I know. But it's, what are these four often called in good Methodist? So,
Quadrilateral.
Quadrilateral. Did Wesley ever use that term?
No.
No. It's more in a term it's invented in the early 60s, Albert Outler, among others. But what you begin to see here, what they see in Wesley, who likes Locke and these people, but he also likes rhetoric. He also studies persuasion because he knows preaching, quite frankly, is not a science.
Right.
Really, the question is, how do you move people? How do you move people to faith? You have to be listening to their experience. You have to be listening to their dilemmas. But how do you do that? And so just as Aristotle has his logos, pathos, ethos, right? Character, pathos is passion, desires, appeal to those things. There seems to be this sense that Wesley would say to make a compelling Christian theological argument, you've got to use some scripture, right? And some speeches, some presentations might emphasize one of these more than others, right? Draw on tradition, draw on some kind of reason, right? Might be psychology at this point in time, might be models of economics, might be all sorts of, the examples of reason in our world are just about too much to count. It's no longer just you got your Plato, you got your Aristotle, deal with it. These are more to it than that as well. But here is, so tradition, reason, experience, right? These are, well, now the question though is, nice little drawing. Have we named these resources of theology? Have we said very much? Right? Well, we've got four foundational pillars. We've got scripture, you can see the thumping going on in terms of saying, yes, we've got sure and certainty because we've got these four foundations that keep us squarely in place. Really? Right? There's real questions going on here. What scriptural texts? I'll go back to that again. And why? Why did you select that letter to the Romans? Why did you select those Corinthians 1-3? Why are you using this gospel narrative of the end of time? Or these prophetic texts? And again, as you begin to ask those questions, suddenly the singular voice of Scripture begins to look a bit more wobbly. And it begins to look a bit more informed by something else. Who are you seeking to move with this discourse and why? Why are you using this text? Okay, that's not just poetics, Jack. See, you're all Jack. That's not, but this is rhetorical. You're forming an argument to speak to a particular time and place, to a particular setting. Or there's multiple settings. Again, we see an explosion of political and religious rhetoric, in part because the situations that are now broadcast to us 24/7 are incredibly numerous. So how we begin to even seek to identify an audience, how we begin to identify a context, we'll get to that in a minute. Right? But which scriptural texts? Oh, God. What forms of reason? And why? Why are you using this Marxist analysis of injustice? Why are you using that? why are you using, Adam Smith here in your discussion of 19th century Western theology? What forms of reason and why? What forms of experience and what about elements of tradition and why? So the four resources end up begging the question of how these resources are in fact intertwined and how you begin to interpret one of these resources shapes the way you interpret other resources. Right? You might get started in your theological process by thinking about experience. Could be the experience of injustice, could be the experience of joy or of gratitude or of trauma. Some very good work being written on these issues. Sarah's talking about disability in her work, right? This begins to identify both a context and something of an orientation that's going to lead her to select some texts and not others. It's going to lead her to draw on some traditions and not others. And as good listeners, we should be thinking about that as she talks. What is she weaving together here? What's the family of terms that she keeps coming back to in terms of community, relationality, right? In terms of response? Oh my goodness. Last night was a good example of a talk that had a rich set of connected themes, also in a sense where it's invisible, right? Often in a good speech, these moves are invisible because they're so well woven together. Jack's good at this. But I have gotten to figure it out. So anyway, what matters? So this is something that we've got going on. What's the why getting at? What's influencing or shaping our choices of scriptural text, traditions, experience? What? That's what the why is when someone gives you their four resources. Well, I'm a Methodist and we've got a method to theology. We've got four resources. Oh, yawn. Because at this point, one can then say, well, what does that mean? Unpack that a bit. So, why illuminates? Why surfaces? Why reveals? The importance of at least this role of context, which is not in even Wesley's quadrilateral, right? In shaping our four resources, in shaping our own sense of why we need to speak on this topic now. What is the urgency? So this is where urgency comes together. But oftentimes, again, in your studies, biblical studies, right? In your studies of biblical and pastoral care, in your classes on church history, you learned again and again about context. And thinking about, it's not just, well, here's the story of what happened. Why did it happen? What's the issue that's framing even the debate that leads to some action? So what is the context? And if you are the speaker in a situation, if you're trying to address a situation, you're trying to listen to those voices, right? But even as then you begin to say, how do I formulate a response? There really is a sense in which that situation calls us. Again, Jack loves this language of call and response. Beautiful. But rhetoric also speaks to this language of call and response. And when you respond, right, it helps to have some sense of how you're putting things together. For those of you who preach, if you're going to preach in a sense with an idea towards developing something of a theological unity in your community, you've got to preach with some savvy around. Because week after week, if you act like you're starting from nothing, you might be starting from nothing. And what's needed is a sense of what's your theological voice. We also wrestle a lot with that in seminary. How do you come to a sense of theological voice? And that doesn't mean that you're better than someone else. It means that you've got to carry some integrity with the voice in which you speak to a community of faith. So, Oh, good. So context also, just to keep this in mind again, context is not static. Context is not just sitting there waiting, here I am, here I'm your context, you know, respond to me. No, right? You have to interpret the context. You have to pay attention. You've got to try to listen to the different voices that are going on in the situation as a way into the work of interpreting the primary text you're trying to interpret. Right? So the idea of context, again, is helpful to know. Say, hey, I know about context. But then the question is, okay, how do you listen to that time and place, whether it's the 15th century, whether it's the 19th century, 3rd century, our time. Right? Don't forget, you're not the only interpreter. There's going to be real differences on interpretation. Right? How do you shape that as part of your task? So in the process, you shape the context. And in shaping the context, you call for an audience to offer a proposal. Again, don't be naive about your audiences. They're coming to church every week. No, they're not. They're heading for the doors. So there's a real sense here in which, again, we help as interpreters of our common life together, which isn't all that common in many ways. But we're there trying to shape a sense of responsibility, a sense of ownership, a sense of call, a sense of vision. Right? So this is part of the task. Again, listening is key to all this. You're not just listening to the text, the biblical text, the constitutional, you're also listening to the present and to the dynamics of the present. Okay, got that from resources. We've just covered resources. I'm trying to demonstrate that the resources, whether it's in rhetoric or in theology, using Wesley as a trope, is to say, this looks like a rhetorical discipline. We're not dealing with things that are demonstrably set or fixed. So, there's Kathy. Is Kathy still here? Here we go. This looks familiar. Maybe some elements of a theological map or something. But notice, and I've just got these 5 up here because I want us to say here again, over the course of Christian tradition, we tend to think these are fixed things. Human beings created in the image of God. Right? There's an affirmation of humanity there, assuming one has a strong affirmation of God. But that said, Genesis never tells you what it is. Augustine will suggest a few options. For example. To have a rational soul. But keep in mind that when he says that, he's not just listening to Genesis, he's listening to Aristotle, Cicero. A rational soul. A rational soul capable of truth, which ends up meaning that God is going to look like truth. So we think these are separate topics. For many of you, perhaps, it certainly was for me. When I was first introduced, it's like, well, nobody ever sat me down and taught me the way in which these topics are interlinked. I just thought there were topics. You know, you got these, sure, let's talk about sin now. Why not? Right? But tell me how you think about this goodness, this initial goodness, this initial affirmation. Great. But then something goes wrong, because it always goes wrong. And this threatens the goodness of however we interpret the image of God. Sin threatens that. Augustine's quite clear on it. Sin's not just a little nicety. Oh, too bad, you'll get better. Yeah. No. This Adam and Eve's sin ruins humanity. Ruins it. Takes the hope that's there and can ask about that too. We can run over a little bit, I'm sure. But then, if this is the problem, then what's the solution? Right? And that solution is going to not only respond to the problem, it's also going to restore this goodness. That's key. Right? But you just can't end the story there. So notice the language of narrative also comes into play. You got a good world, you got a problem, you got a savior, end of story. Great story. Beautiful, beautiful. No, the issue ends up being, and notice this is a rhetorical issue, not a philosophical one. The question is, how do we come to participate in this story? Or there's the invitation. Paul's out there, beat his brains out, trying to offer an invitation to join. And does he use the historical language, historical Jesus language? It's like forgetting the historical Jesus on purpose. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the Christ. We're interested in spirit over flesh. We're interested, and this has real echoes in the Platonic worldview. The worldview that informs this. So here again, what emerges is a community that now is following this Savior. And this then is the discourse of rebuilding community in light of the problem. This community is always going to play off of and still be correcting this problem of sin, right? Even though Jesus is the exemplar. And then the future, we think eschatology. The future which is as much coming at us as we are going toward it. And the future here ends up being a sense of, is there a sense of hope? Is there a sense? Right. So even here, and this is a steal at any price, but even in terms of, in your second appendix, you're going to get a sense of how this plays out politically. I love political speeches. And so I'm looking at how political speeches actually walk through these topics. And in the past, along with folks like Martin Marty and others, I would have said, well, this shows the impact of Christian thought on political structures. And my question is to say, maybe not. Maybe it's to say that Christian thought ends up being political. And it's political because this ends up being a structure of proposals, of you affirm an audience. If you don't affirm them, you got to have a good reason not to affirm them. Otherwise, why listen? Why are they going to listen? Then you've got to identify the problem. Then you've got to talk about the healing, the problem that restores that goodness. And then you begin to say, oh, and and this is the truth you get if you vote for me. If you're not voting for Bill Clinton, you're not going to get this good stuff I'm talking about. Right? So if you're not following Jesus, you're not going to get the truth here. This is how this plays rhetorically. And we're not going to have a future that we're moving to. Future is going to look like it's falling down again. Because we don't yet have, and this is a real anxiety, is it not, among churches today? That having peaked in terms of cultural influence, we're now losing it. Interesting. Okay. So if you say, where is God in this? It differs, right? In this classical model of God, right? I'm asking you to view these topics more as moves. Oh, we're back to that again. That moving stuff is dynamic interaction shaping the interpretation of one another. How you interpret one topic shapes the way you interpret the other topic. Right? These are moves. Right? Why these five? Because there is a purpose. Together they construct a proposal. There's a nice little book called Everything's an Argument, and one of the chapters is on proposal. They focus on the three middle topics, but I'm correcting them, of course, but I'm saying there might be five topics here. Theology involves a rhetorical form. Here's the classical, and it's really the imperial, where God is above, God is outside of time, God creates the world, sin, we do that all on our own, right? God can't be impure. God is outside of time. The Christ here, the Word of God becomes flesh, right? Restores by virtue of his death, restores the sin that was of pride, right? So Jesus resolves it by his own humility. Philippians 2:6 and following. Right? Grace and faith, I've got here because these are dynamics that inform the life of the church, but also the dynamics of the priority of the Holy Spirit. God is above. This is what's really real. Here's the Word, the world, less than real, but there you go. So you've got to worship the true God in order to be included in the truth. Don't take this one to heart. I'm just trying to figure out, here's someone like Tillich's ontological ground of being, right? For him, the Christ, again, is an abstract philosophical sense, the new being. And it's like, could you get a little more concrete, Paul? But there's the new being. Sin ends up being the problem of failure of our capacity to be. And again, he likes the existential and psychological language of authenticity. So I love the language, courage to be, famous work of his, right? Some marvelous work he's done on socialism as well, and the socialist decision. And not too many people have read that. They should. But what are theologians doing when they're engaged in this work? They're offering proposals, which they hope persons at this point, whether they're in the church or not. And here again, I ask you to pay attention to their language because you should be able to figure that out. Are they talking just to the church or are they talking to the rest of society? That's very interesting. To a richer understanding and perhaps more committed practice of faith. Even faith here is going to shift a bit more in Caputo, for example, but also others, Catherine Keller, for a whole range of people, certainly among the liberation theologians, where faith looks less like right belief, which is all tied up in confessional theologies and the Christian wars and all this. And it's more associated with the language of courage, which then moves you to doing. There's going to be a focus on doing, not just believing, doing. Right? I think I'm about to. If you ask what primal experience is on this, is this kind of rhetorical form based, the answer is the experience of being moved. This is when you go back to image of God, you can begin sketching in there the capacity to be moved. Moved by what? Capacity to be moved by difference, not simply by sameness. Which then begins to set up the problem of sin, sin ends up looking in our cultural and public works like we set down the barriers of who's in and who's out, who's worth listening to and who's not. And then one looks to the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament for stories that might well illuminate that very capacity and the urgency that's called for in engaging that model. And then you can begin to say, what a genuine community. Caputo is very much, he likes the deconstructive work of Derrida, and he'll say basically when it comes to this topic or discussion of church, we're still in a very deconstructive phase. He says he's very suspicious of rebuilding a sacred, unified politic. And if that's the problem, and it kind of clearly is, he says, let's not just rush into the formation of a new community. With a future coming at us, ambiguous, are we ever sure? No. He loves Kierkegaard here on the risk of faith, but the risk of faith is not a leaping of right belief, it's the leaping into life, the openness to life. Okay, well, that's enough. Enough of that stuff. But I hope there was a little renewal as well as remind. But are there some questions or issues you'd like to talk about?
Dr. Bessler, you?
Yes.
So you would argue that Caputo is actually more rhetorical than he would want to admit?
That he's what?
That he's more rhetorical and trying to be persuasive more than he would want to admit?
Yes.
What would you say he's trying to persuade us to?
Just what I told you.
Just that right there, that
In other words,
not to jump into.
he says, most of my life, he said, I realized, I think he says this in The Weakness of God. But he says, much of my professional life, he says, is dedicated to helping move people of conventional faith move to a more radical understanding of faith. By radical, he primarily means something that's really quite different in terms of what it asks of us, right? So Jack was very complimentary in his comments to me when I finished this up, and I was sending him drafts and stuff. And he says, he said, nobody, so he's got these interpreters in Europe, they've had, different things, and here in the States, he says, nobody's taken this tack before. And he said, frankly, I wasn't aware of Farrell's work. I wasn't aware of really the importance of rhetorical theory and its reemergence. He said, you nailed me on these things, because he clearly at points wants to avoid, it's almost as if he's ashamed of it. And I said, let me get this straight. You're a weak theologian and you're ashamed of something? Oh, I smell a rat. So there's a way in which, yes. So I think his work is real brilliant, but I think there's also that piece. And so, we have very good discussions on that. He says, I bet you think it's rhetoric all the way down. Pretty close.
Is he presenting this framework of weakness as actually being strength? I mean, is
Interesting
that
question.
part of the sneakiness?
Well, this is also, it comes up in some interviews. And in one, he's a bit exasperated, and he says, look, I'm speaking polemically. And when I talk about a weak theology. So this sent me to my glossary. I don't think it was AI, but I went to somewhere, and it's like polemic. And it's all the terms are warlike, battle imagery, confrontation. I mean, it's all this. And I said, interesting for a weak theologian.
So he's elevating weakness as, in fact, strength.
As I think a strategic. And this again is why I want to say poetics. Poetics isn't strong enough for what you're doing. Poetics suggests, we're sipping, to me, it's a little bit like we're sipping too much tea and, and really what he's doing is he's challenging. He's really wanting to challenge a system. What he's trying to do, though, as well, is he wants to keep a conversation going between more conventional faith and a more radical faith. I mean, in all fairness to him, he keeps trying to do that. And I think at some point, I'm not sure that's working, right? Now, he's also interested, his work goes in the direction of phenomenology, a very big word, meaning, this attention to experience and bringing some real heavy intellectual models to it. Peter can give you a better sense of it than I can. And in my book, I don't get into phenomenology because in some ways I'm quite taken with this absent attention to rhetoric. Even as I said to him, Jack, you're so incredibly good at it. and he says, yeah, I kind of am. In the context of.
So he's trying to keep the conversation open in order to persuade into a more a willingness to accept a lack of certainty.
Right, about our belief claims, about our superiority.
But it doesn't work with at least that doesn't work with the people in my life who are so damn certain.
He does have, again, I think this is in Weakness, where he says, I wonder if there are some ministers and of the sure and certain variety who sometimes wake at 2 a.m. in a cold sweat, realizing that what they've been preaching is the truth of Revelation is actually an accident of birth. That had they been born in Iran, or had they been born in China, or born in Korea, or born in Latin America, or born in a Catholic place when they grew up, that's going to be a primary shaping. And if they can't affirm those different places of growing, right? What kind of superiority do you have except a militaristic kind? So is Jack being, again, this is why I think rhetoric is more helpful than poesis, because I think at some level, while he wants to hold together a vision of peace, he is willing, he's wanting to say, and I think he's fairly compelling in saying, boy, these folks aren't paying attention to that at all. They seem to be paying attention to their superiority. And they seem to be claiming it. And that might be what you're experiencing as well in your community. So I think he's both important to read for all of that. And then it's at any price, I mean, it's just really good commentary. Yeah.
Dr. Bessler.
Yes.
Hi. So for what you just talked about in terms of the rhetoric being more effective than the poesis, do you think, or I mean, what do you think about poetics though as being something that, coming back to the phenomenology piece of this, is a more experiential aspect? And if you're thinking about the person waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning,
Yes.
isn't that a poetic phenomenological experience as opposed to a rhetorical one? And how might that, I mean, could there be some inherent rhetoric with the poetics?
Jack is a very interesting read on this, because on the one hand, he really wants to show that he's read the liberationists and has been moved by them. So he wants to get to action. The problem is, as I see it, is poesis doesn't really get you there. It gets you, or at least it doesn't get you to a forceful, but it does begin to get to how do I speak of change within the person. And again, I think he could be clearer in kind of laying that out. But you're right, absolutely right on in terms of saying I think phenomenology really develops a way in which Jack's language can haunt you. The language itself, he's a good student of Heidegger who really understood, for all of his problems, but who really understood how you weave language together to make a world. I mean, and so he's quite good at that, and therefore it can become a sense of here's a world I'd like to belong to. Here's a world I'd like to, visit more than once. Does that help?
I was going to suggest that poetics is a tool of rhetoric for him in a way. I mean, Heaney is moving us to a place in Ireland that some of us have never seen.
Yeah.
And the works, the poetics of Alice Walker and Amanda Gorman moved to action. Absolutely. The poetics of Martin Luther King did that.
Right.
So, and he was an incredibly rhetorical preacher,
Yes.
but also a poetic one.
Yes.
So I'm not sure that they are versus each other. I think they are both and.
That's what I tried to say in my preface in terms of saying, I'm not looking for a battle here.
You're not looking for a polemic.
But in that sense, I want us to think about, how that poetics, you might want to say rhetoric belongs in poetics, because you might, I'm more in your camp on this, but
The goal is persuasion either way.
but I think those are questions that, he can certainly hear.
Let's just blow off the rest of the night. This is great stuff. Thank you. I don't want to cut you off if you have a final.
No.
Okay, well, Joe will be available for more conversations.
Yes.
We are supposed to head to the president's reception in the Chapman Commons, which is the far north end of the building, just right in front of the library. So that will be more of an opportunity to visit as well. And are you gonna head down there too, so we can talk to you down there?
so.
All right, perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathy.